A 67-year-old widow named Dorothy spent last winter sleeping in the back seat of a 2006 Buick in a church parking lot in Ohio. She had worked in a school cafeteria for 31 years. When her husband died and the medical bills took the house, she parked somewhere quiet, locked the doors, and tried to disappear. But then a group of volunteers, most of them retired women her own age, showed up in that same parking lot with lumber, drills, and a plan built around one number: $300 per wall. What that $300 wall built for Dorothy, and what it is now building in cities across America, is where this story starts. To understand why these villages exist, you first need to understand who is actually falling into homelessness right now, because it is not who most people picture. According to the federal government's own count from January 2025, roughly 745,000 people in America were in shelters, in temporary housing, or sleeping outside on a given night. Buried inside that number is a shift that caught researchers off guard. Women over the age of 50 have become one of the fastest-growing groups of homeless Americans. Social workers in Phoenix, Sacramento, and Tampa report the same pattern over and over. A widow loses her husband, and half the household income vanishes overnight. A divorce at 55 splits a retirement that was barely enough for one household. A rent increase of $200 a month lands on a woman living on a fixed Social Security check, and the math simply stops working. She did everything right for 50 years and still ended up sleeping in her car outside a Walmart. Dorothy's slide took less than a year. Her husband drove a delivery truck for 3 decades, and when his heart gave out, his pension check was cut nearly in half for his survivor. The hospital bills from his final months arrived for a full year after the funeral. She sold the house to settle them, moved into a 1-bedroom apartment, and then watched the rent climb $85 one year and $110 the next, while her check stayed exactly the same. She skipped her blood pressure medication some months to make the difference. Then one February, she did the math at her kitchen table and realized the numbers would never work again, no matter what she cut. She was 66 years old, and the car was the only asset left with her name on it. And here's the part almost nobody sees, because women like Dorothy work very hard to make sure nobody sees it. There is an entire hidden routine to living in a car as an older woman, and outreach workers say it looks remarkably similar from city to city. A $12 a month gym membership, not for the treadmills, but for the showers. A rotation of 3 or 4 parking spots, so no property manager notices the same car twice in 1 week. Towels folded across the back windows that could pass for laundry. Church on Sunday and clean clothes, hair done, so that not even the congregation knows. One outreach coordinator in Sacramento said the women she serves are the hardest population to find in the entire homeless system because they have spent their whole lives being presentable, and they are not going to stop now. The car is not the worst part, several of them told her. The worst part is the knock. A flashlight against the glass at 2 a.m, and not knowing whether the person holding it is there to help you or hurt you. Which raises the obvious question: why not just go to a shelter? And this is where the system fails women in a very specific way. When a man ends up on the street, an emergency shelter is uncomfortable and chaotic. When an older woman ends up on the street, that same shelter can be genuinely dangerous. Outreach workers in Los Angeles and Chicago will tell you that unaccompanied women avoid congregate shelters at higher rates than almost any other group, and their reasons are not complicated. Rows of cots shared with strangers, belongings stolen while you sleep, harassment in hallways and bathrooms with no door and no lock anywhere in the building. Add in the fact that domestic violence is one of the leading causes of homelessness for women in America, and the picture sharpens. Many of these women became homeless specifically because homes stopped being safe. Handing them a cot in a crowded room full of strangers does not solve that problem. It recreates it. So thousands of women choose the car instead, They choose the 24-hour parking lot with good lighting. They choose invisibility because invisibility feels safer than the system built to help them. That is the gap a retired hospice nurse in Ohio decided to close, and the way she did it is why this video exists. We will call her Carol because she has asked local reporters to keep the spotlight on the women she serves, rather than on herself. Around 2021, Carol was volunteering at a church food pantry outside Columbus when she started noticing the same cars in the parking lot week after week. A Honda with towels folded across the back windows. A minivan with a sunshade up at 10 o'clock at night. So one evening, she poured 2 cups of coffee, wrapped a sandwich in a napkin, and knocked on the window of the Honda. The woman inside cracked the window 2 inches and apologized. That was the first thing she did. She apologized for being there and asked if she needed to move the car. Carol said no. She just thought she might want some coffee, and the woman stared at her for a long moment and then started to cry. She was a former dental receptionist. The minivan held the widow of a truck driver. 2 rows over was a 71-year-old great-grandmother named Ruth, who had been living in her Chevy for 14 months. Carol had spent 30 years sitting with people at the end of their lives, and she said later that nothing in those 30 years prepared her for the sight of a woman her own age brushing her teeth with a water bottle in a church parking lot. But Carol did not have money, and she did not have construction experience. What she had was a church full of retirees and an idea she borrowed from quilting. When a quilting circle makes a quilt, no single person makes the whole thing. Each woman makes 1 square, and the squares get stitched together. So Carol asked a simple question: what if a house worked the same way? A local contractor helped her design a standardized insulated wall panel, 8 feet long, framed lumber, rigid foam insulation, plywood sheathing, weather wrap. The materials for 1 complete panel cost right around $300. A team of 4 people with no experience can build one on sawhorses in a church parking lot in about 3 hours. Bolt enough panels together on a simple floor platform, and you get a finished, insulated, lockable tiny home. That $300 number turned out to be the key that unlocked everything, because almost nobody can donate a house, but a Sunday school class can sponsor a wall. A book club can sponsor a wall. A retired couple celebrating their anniversary can sponsor a wall instead of buying each other gifts. Carol's church held its first wall-raising day in the spring of 2022, and the contractor set it up like an assembly line. 1 station for measuring and marking, 1 chop saw station with a retired shop teacher supervising, 1 station for framing, 1 for insulation and sheathing. Every volunteer got a 15-minute safety lesson and a job matched to what their hands could do. 60 volunteers, most of them women over 55, built enough panels for 4 complete homes in a single Saturday. Grandmothers ran chop saws. A 74-year-old former librarian learned to drive structural screws, and by the end of the day, she was teaching the technique to a college student who had wandered over from the coffee table. Each finished panel got signed in permanent marker by the people who built it, so the woman who eventually lived inside those walls would know the names of the neighbors who put them up. The first 4 homes went to 4 women from that same parking lot. Dorothy got the second one. She hung her late husband's photograph on a wall signed by 11 strangers. Ruth, the great-grandmother from the Chevy, got the 4th. She was the oldest resident and the last to say yes, because after 14 months in the car, she had stopped believing that anything offered for free came without a catch. The volunteers did not argue with her. They just parked the finished home where she could see it from her usual spot and left the key with the pantry coordinator. It took her 9 days to use it. The first thing she did inside was plug in an electric kettle. because she had gone more than a year without being able to make herself a cup of tea. What Carol did not know that spring was that her hardest fight was still ahead, and it had nothing to do with lumber or money. Because this was not happening in isolation. Roughly 2,400 miles west in Seattle, the most ambitious version of this idea was already standing. In 2019, the Low Income Housing Institute opened Whittier Heights Village in the Ballard neighborhood of Seattle, a tiny house village built specifically for women. Rows of small cedar-sided homes, each one with a locking door, electricity, light, and heat, arranged around shared bathrooms, a kitchen, laundry, and on-site case managers. And in a detail that made national news, the village was built largely by women. Female carpenters, tradeswomen, and volunteer crews organized women-led build days where retirees worked alongside professional builders to raise the homes. That detail was not symbolic. Residents arriving at the village, many of them coming out of abusive situations, were told that the walls around them had been raised by other women, and case managers said that single fact lowered the guard of new arrivals faster than anything else they tried. The case managers mattered just as much as the walls. Each resident works with one person who knows her name and her file, someone who helps her replace a stolen ID, untangle a social security issue, or apply for the senior housing list that can take years to clear. Seattle's broader tiny house village network has since moved thousands of people off the streets across King and Pierce counties, and the overwhelming majority of residents who reached permanent housing were still housed a year later. But the women's village proved something more specific than any statistic. When you design for safety, when every resident has a door that locks and a community of other women around her. The women who refused every shelter bed in the city finally said yes. One resident, a 58-year-old former bank teller who had fled an abusive marriage and spent 2 years sleeping in her car, described her first night this way. She locked the door, sat down on the bed, and turned the deadbolt back and forth just to hear the sound. Then she slept for 11 hours. She said it was the first time in 2 years that her body actually believed it was allowed to rest. Her home measured 8 feet by 12 feet. The apartment she fled had 3 bedrooms. She said the tiny house felt bigger because fear takes up more room than furniture ever could. Now, a lot of you watching this are probably wondering what you can actually do, because not everyone has a church parking lot and a wall building crew nearby. Every volunteer group in this video runs into the same problem. The homes take weeks to fund and build, but the women they meet are cold tonight. The volunteers who found Dorothy that first winter carried something in their trunks for exactly that gap. It is called a TerraShell, a thermal bivvy with a reflective lining that bounces a person's own body heat back to them. No batteries, no setup. You climb in, and within minutes, it traps a pocket of warm air around your whole body. It is windproof, water-resistant, and folds down small enough to fit in a glove box. People keep one in the car or buy a bundle and hand them out to someone sleeping outside in their own community. It costs less than a dinner out. The link is in the description below. While Carol's crew was building in Ohio and the Seattle village was filling up, the same model was taking root in the middle of the country. In Springfield, Missouri, Eden Village built a gated community of tiny homes for the chronically homeless, with a significant number of homes going to older women. Each house is permanently affordable, and each resident is treated as a neighbor rather than a case file. Visitors describe front porches with rocking chairs, flower beds under the windows, and residents who introduce themselves by name instead of looking away. And across Texas and the Carolinas, church women's groups have copied the wall sponsorship model almost exactly, holding build days where the price of admission is $300 and a free Saturday. A movement that started with one nurse knocking on car windows now has chapters run by women who have never met her. If stories like this matter to you, hit subscribe. I cover what ordinary Americans are building with their own hands every single week, and the next few stories in the series are already on the channel. By the fall of 2025, Carol's operation had grown from 4 homes in a parking lot to a permitted village of 22 homes on 2 acres of donated church land, with a waiting list she describes as the hardest document she has ever had to read. The village has a shared garden where residents grow tomatoes and green beans in raised beds built from leftover wall lumber. It has a community room where a retired hairdresser in home number 9 gives free haircuts every other Thursday. Ruth runs a Tuesday tea hour there now with the same electric kettle. And it has a rule that surprises visitors. Every woman who moves out into permanent housing is invited back for wall-raising days. On the other side of the drill this time, Dorothy has now helped build panels for 11 homes. She signs every one of them, and the numbers behind villages like hers are the part that should make every taxpayer in America sit up. A complete home in Carol's village costs between $4,000 and $6,000 in materials, funded $300 at a time. The entire 22-home village, including utilities, shared buildings, and site work, came in under $400,000, and it went from empty field to occupied home in under 8 months. Compare that to what the traditional system produces. Los Angeles spent $300 million on its Inside Safe initiative, and according to the city's own data, roughly 40% of the people placed into housing ended up right back on the streets. A group of retired women in Ohio housed 22 of their neighbors for less than the cost of a single unit of government-built affordable housing in California. And so far, not one of their residents has returned to the parking lot. Small is faster, faster is cheaper. And cheaper means more women come inside before winter instead of after it. But remember that fight I mentioned, the one Carol never saw coming. It was not with money or weather, it was with her own county. When her group applied to place the first 4 homes on church property, the zoning office classified the finished, insulated, lockable homes as storage sheds, which cannot legally be slept in. Carol drove to the county office with photographs of the insulation, the wiring plan, and the smoke detectors, and a clerk told her, politely, that the classification was based on square footage, not quality. The homes were too small to legally be homes. What followed was 9 months of hearings, continuances, and letters, longer than it took to build every home in the village combined. At one hearing, a board member asked whether the structures might attract the wrong element to the neighborhood, and Carol stood up and read the names of the 4 women waiting to move in, along with the number of years each had lived in a parked car. The room went quiet. The variance passed 3 weeks later. The same pattern has repeated across the country. Volunteers can raise a home in a weekend, but permits can take a year or more. And building codes written decades ago never imagined a 120-square-foot home as a legitimate residence. Some cities have confiscated volunteer-built homes outright and hauled them to the dump, while the people who lived in them stood watching. Yet the pressure is starting to move in the other direction, because in county meetings across Ohio, Missouri, and Tennessee, the people showing up to testify for zoning changes are increasingly gray-haired women holding photographs of the homes they built with their own hands. Zoning boards, it turns out, have a very hard time saying no to a room full of grandmothers. So how are Americans building $300 tiny house villages for homeless women? One wall at a time, one Saturday at a time, signed in permanent marker by retired nurses, librarians, teachers, and widows who decided that women their own age were not going to spend another winter sleeping in parked cars. When a local reporter asked Carol why she spends her retirement on sawhorses in a parking lot, she said she spent 30 years helping people leave this world with dignity, and now she wanted to help a few of them live in it with dignity too. Dorothy said something simpler. The first morning she woke up in her tiny home, she made coffee, sat in the doorway, and read the names written on her wall. 11 strangers. She said it was the first time in 2 years she felt like somebody's neighbor again. There are still hundreds of thousands of people out there tonight with nowhere to go. And a growing number of them are women who look like your mother, your sister, or you. But in a church parking lot in Ohio, a 74-year-old former librarian is learning to use a chop saw, and a wall that costs $300 is waiting for a name to be signed on it. The video on screen right now covers the men doing the exact same thing for homeless veterans, and that story connects directly to this one. Click it, and I will see you there.